Welcome to another Caroline Glick Show. Uh, this is, I think, my last recording from Chicago before I go home. But unless there's then war breaks out, or whatever, ha ha ha. Then I'll do an extra one. But otherwise, I'll see you guys next week. We may get smacked at any moment. Obviously, we've been in this holding pattern, kind of annoying to me. We should be preempting it. There's no reason for us to be sitting around waiting for somebody to kill us. All the same. We have to talk about the strategic environment, where we are, what we are, look at the other actors, obviously, first and foremost, the United States and the Biden-Harris administration, and Iran, Hezbollah, Iran, Russia, Iran, Hamas, all of them. And so the person that I always go to for the, up at 30,000 feet assessment of the strategic environment that we operate in is my old friend, the old friend of the Caroline Glick Show, Dr. David Wurmser. It's also my colleague at the Center for Security Policy in Washington. So again, thank you so much for, again, gracing me with your presence, David. It's great to have you back on the show.
It's always an honor, Caroline. It's always an honor.
So I was driving through Chicago today, and I was listening to Ben Shapiro gleefully talking about the Minnesota governor pick for Kamala Harris, Tim Walz. He said, you couldn't find a worse candidate for vice president, which is, I guess, funny because he's such a progressive Black Lives Matter guy. He has these Islamists in major positions in his state. Keith, what's his name, is the Secretary of State who had ties to Farrakhan and the Muslim Brotherhood when he was in Congress, and obviously Ilhan Omar. And he apparently is birds of a feather. Anyway, so it's all good and well when you're talking about the presidential election, that if you want to use somebody's radicalism against a ticket. But what does it tell us about Kamala Harris? What does it tell us about the state of U.S.-Israel relations today, when Israel is on the precipice of an escalation in the already regional war that has been waged against us by Iran and its proxies since October 7th? How do you read that? How do other people read that?
Yeah, it was an odd choice that reflects on her judgment. So that's the first thing. I mean, there's a number of things that are very odd here. Apart from the fact that the obvious choice, Shapiro from Pennsylvania, could have helped her with what is really the state that will decide the election in November by what everybody thinks now. Now, that may change till November. But currently, the consensus in both parties was this election is going to be largely decided by which way Pennsylvania goes. And Shapiro is a very popular governor in Pennsylvania. 60% support him. So at the end of the day, it's quite surprising she didn't choose him. But the real reason why she didn't choose him is what really worries a lot of people, which is it's obvious that she didn't choose. He was the front runner. Everybody basically assumed he was going to be the candidate. It seems that she didn't choose him because the far left radicals didn't want a Jew, despite the fact that he came out over the last few weeks disowning his Judaism, so to speak, by going against Israel, attacking Netanyahu, all sorts of things. At the end of the day, he made it very clear that he was going to leave all that behind and pay the price of de-Jewifying himself, essentially, to be the candidate. And he was thrown under the bus because he was Jewish, apparently. So I think there's a great deal of agony in the Jewish community, the liberal Jewish community, which does matter in this national election. There's a great deal of agony in non-Jewish people who are not radical leftists, who are liberals. So I think this shows a political lapse that I'm rather disturbed about. The second thing is that Walz, which isn't for us, but Walz is very pro-Chinese. And the blue-collar vote in the Rust Belt, which is the only other area that's really going to decide this election, does not like free trade with China, does not like the free trade policies vis-a-vis China at all. They want protection for their industries and so forth. So to put in Walz really writes off that Rust Belt vote in America. Again, that's her choice. I think it's a political mistake. People make political mistakes. I think what it shows, though, is she's not ready for prime time. She doesn't really have the sixth sense for how to run this. The second thing that's important about that is she chose somebody who, other than China, has no foreign policy experience. And she has no foreign policy experience, which means they're going to be at the mercy of their staff. And the staff that we know Kamala Harris has is very anti Israeli, is dangerously tolerant of Iran. And I would imagine that Governor Walz's staff, whom he'll pick, will probably be of the same ilk. So I think what we're seeing is an imbalanced far left drift at the top of the ticket that will not have a balance, that will not have a check when they get into the White House if they're elected. And for that, I think Israel really has to assume that if they're elected, everything that needs to be done has to be done now.
Right, it's not going to get any better. I
It's not
mean,
going to get, if they're
basically,
elected,
the
it's not going
state
to
of
get any better.
U.S.-Israel relations is the best we're going to see uh, in the foreseeable future, assuming that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz win the election on November 5th. And I think that anybody who's planning has to assume that when they're planning, because it's better to
Yeah.
have a plan for that scenario than to have a plan for a more positive one that you'll be able to maneuver with anyway, because it's a more positive situation if a Trump Pence victory is in the offing on November 5th. So I agree with you. And, so now we're looking at a situation in the White House where Biden is, I mean, he was pushed off of the ticket because of his cognitive incapacitation, or at least what do you want to call it, sickness. And he's still president until January 20th, no matter what. Not, and we're looking at the drift of his policy. At a time when Israel is apparently facing an imminent assault by Iran, Hezbollah, and whoever else they want to bring in. I would assume the Iranian-controlled militias in Iraq and other places. So what does it mean that the United States is bringing all of these naval assets to the region? How is Israel supposed to look at the American deployment now ahead of or in the midst of an imminent assault by Iran that could begin whenever?
Yeah, it's a complex question. Some of the ships are there partly to evacuate Americans in a crisis. When this goes back all the way to October, when the aircraft carriers were put off the coast, they sort of had two functions. One function was supposedly to deter Hezbollah, although I don't think anybody really seriously believed the United States would intervene on behalf of Israel. I heard a lot of Israelis think it, but I don't think they understood America if they really believed that. Those ships were there partly to give Israel a palliative so that Israel doesn't lose it, so to speak, in the American lexicon. On one side, and the other side to evacuate Americans in a moment of extreme crisis in Beirut or Amman or Cairo. So, at any rate, I think part of the American deployment is a comfort blanket for Israel to prevent Israel from doing what it needs to do sometimes.
So you're
And
saying
right
it's
now,
to contain Israel. So you're saying that the Americans send all these assets in order to contain Israel?
I think yes, but I think the containment is more complex than simply providing Israel with a warm blanket. There is an active element to this that the United States says we'll step in and we'll help you stop all these missiles if you passively wait for them to start. So at this point, what you get is that it's not only saying, oh, we're there for you, it's actually saying, your defense is partly going to be supplemented by us. But the cost of that will be that you have to pay the price of listening to us and what we want you to do, which is nothing if all the missiles or most of the missiles are stopped. So I think it is a containment of Israel, but it's a containment that includes a certain degree of active defense of Israel. So that's why I say it's more complex. But I think at the end of the day, it's still the bottom line of American policies. They're more worried about what Israel will do than what Iran does. They're worried about what Iran does because it can trigger what Israel may do. But at the end of the day, what worries them is Israel's response, which is truly befuddling circumstance, in my view.
So put it in two different levels. What is the importance of what's happening in the Middle East now with Iran and its proxies lined up against Israel for the United States? Period. It just from an objective perspective, and then we can go if we want to revisit the Biden administration's assessment of the threat. But what is, objectively speaking, the implications of what's happening for the United States?
I think the implications of what's happening for the United States is that there's a tremendous amount of instability in the region that is going to lead to a major war. No actor in the region who opposes America is really effectively calculating in America as a threat, and therefore feels relatively free to strike and free to attack American interests and allies. So, objectively speaking, from my point of view, the American interest right now is there's a reality that America has limited power. We are not mobilized for global conflict, despite the fact that for 2 years now we essentially are in a global conflict. Whether it was wise to get involved in Ukraine or not is a separate question. The fact is, we are in a global conflict. China also looks at this. We have North Korea, we have Taiwan threatened. The United States has problems all over the world, and it hasn't mobilized. So America has limited power, and it does not have the luxury of really intervening heavily in the Middle East without leaving other vital interests unguarded against enemies that could well act. So to me, it would seem that the irreducible American interest is to ensure a tremendous Israeli victory to anchor an alliance in the region that respects Israeli power. In other words, Israel emerges as the strong horse around which other nations see some degree of protection, like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and also reverses the strategic momentum to put pressure not on Israel from all this ring of fire surrounding Israel, but put pressure on Iran by really bearing down on it. The sort of things Israel's talking about, if it responds to a strike or preempts or whatever, it's in the American interest to let Israel win and win big so that America can neglect the region and turn its limited power elsewhere. America is not limited in power by industrial limits or so forth. It's limited in power by choice. America will mobilize eventually and will have to meet these challenges, but it's in no position to do so right now. So it really relies on its regional ally, Israel, to deliver regional stability. And that is why an Israeli victory is so essential.
Why is it though then that Harris, that Biden, that Blinken, that all the rest of them, what isn't what is it that they're not? Why? What do they see? I mean, they don't
Well, what
understand the
they
limits of
see
America
is
power. What I mean,
they see the same limits, but their view is that Iran causes the instability, and therefore it is to Iran you must go in order to reach a deal, to come to an accommodation. And yes, America will have to pay the piper. It will have to concede strategically huge interests in the region to Iran. And let's call this for what it is, appease Iran into acquiescing into a regional form of stability that is under essentially Pax Iranica. That is the American policy. Now they have the commitment to Israel. They feel that it's very difficult to get to this Pax Iranica without a deal over the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. You have President Obama about 10 years ago had a conference call with the Conference of Major American Presidents of the Major American Jewish Organizations Conference. And in it, he said something quite revealing. He said that Israel isn't willing to make peace. Israel's the obstacle, and it isn't willing to make peace because Israel feels too strong. So the fact that Israel feels weak, dependent, has been bashed, actually for them offers an opportunity to finally move toward a two-state solution, which they see as the only mechanism to sort of shut down that front so that they can appease the Iranians enough to have a Pax Iranica and have the Iranians not have the currency anymore to cause too much instability anymore among Palestinians. That's the worldview of this administration. Those who genuinely still want Israel to survive, but don't see it the way Israelis would see it or that I see it. There are those in the administration that I think have worse and more nefarious intentions than that. I do not believe that somebody like Maher Bitar, who's the senior director not only for intelligence, but also now he's been combined senior director for defense, and he's a senior counselor or a counselor for the president. Really one of the most powerful people in America right now. I do not believe that he thinks Israel should exist. I'm not entirely sure Samantha Power believes that Israel should exist. I don't see anything in the record to indicate that they would tremendously lose a lot of sleep were Israel to disappear. So I think you have a combination of some who believe Israel is a colonial power, which is we're better off without, and some who do care about Israel, but just their worldview is unaligned with the realities of the Middle East.
Well, what do you think will happen if to the United States if Kamala Harris gets elected and she and Tim Walz and their merry band of progressives continue to manage American foreign policy in the Middle East for the next 4 years? What will be the implications for the United States?
The implications for the United States will be what happened to Britain in the 50s and 60s. It'll be the end of the presence of the United States in the region. Nobody will take America seriously. Nobody will respect it. The Israelis already are the last Mohicans. They're the last ones who really defer and respect American power. Everybody else has made their deals with China and whoever else they need to make deals with in order to survive. I think the same thing would happen in Asia. I think you might see a dam burst there where Taiwan, South Korea, all the rest of them will begin to understand that America just isn't there for them, uh, especially with Tim Walz now, being sort of a China-phile, cinephile. So I don't know. I don't really think
He
there's going to
lived
be a
in
great deal of
China for
conflict.
10 years. I mean, he's
And has visited 30 times since Tiananmen Square, and has come out quite openly and said that all these protectionist policies against China should end, etc. So yeah, there's definitely concern, I'm sure, in South Korea, Taiwan, and Tokyo right now about this choice, and it's valid because America could find itself challenged. If I were Xi. And Xi is a very destabilizing figure. I'd be careful of Xi. This is an unsettled person. He could lash out. He could see American weakness in act. So I think that what you're seeing is the sort of faltering of Western will if she were elected that led to great wars like the 30s in Europe.
all right. So now let's just go back to the immediate position we're in today. Why do you think that Israel isn't just preemptively attacking Iran? I mean, here they are threatening to, I don't know, send us back to the Stone Age or whatever it is. And we're sitting there putting up, battening the hatches. Why would we do that? Why aren't we preemptively attacking?
There could be several reasons why it isn't happening or why it isn't happening yet. I'll go for the isn't happening first. First is what you and I have discussed before, which is we have a general staff of the Israeli military which doesn't want to wake up in the morning without approval from Washington. It still has a huge influence over the decision-making process of the top staff of the military and the larger pressure brought to bear by the defense elites of Israel, what in Israel is called the Shavarim, the retirees, and so forth. So that's one area which is quite concerning. The second area is the delusion, the idea that, if Israel simply holds the line until whatever, either Trump takes over or whatever, then Israel can act. and the United States will act. And the United States can do so much more than Israel can. So we should wait for the United States. So you have that sort of a mentality too, and that affects even the more conservative side in Israel sometimes. Uh, so I think those are two. The third area is, well, it's sort of a short-sightedness. Well, the United States can stop a lot of those missiles. The Israeli Air Force may not be in a great position to stop those missiles in its entirety, number one. And number two, a lot of those missiles really should be stopped over Iraq and Jordan. And Iraq and Jordan won't let the Israelis fly freely over their territory to do so up front at the beginning of such an operation. So to stop the maximum number of missiles, Israel really ought to have the United States involved, and the United States has made it clear it won't help if Israel preempts. I would argue there's a counterpoint to that, which is whatever damage Israel does in a preemptive strike would be so much greater in terms of utility in stopping missiles than the defensive absorption of those missiles. I think there's no advantage to defensively stopping missiles. Every advantage is to striking first. So whatever Israel gains by deferring, I think it loses by giving up on a preemptive strike. So those are two reasons why why Israel wouldn't preempt. There might also be a failure of nerve by the top staff. They really still believe that they can signal Iran strongly enough to deter them from doing something significant. And we know that the military is enamored with the idea of deterrence and hasn't let go of it yet. We hear it with their talk about Hezbollah as well. They still haven't turned the corner in thinking about war fighting and winning. They're still thinking about management and deterrence. First of all, you need to know the enemy really is going to strike. And I'm not sure the United States and others are fully reconciled to that. So I think that there's a certain element where diplomatically that Israel may want to defer. I don't agree with it, but I could see some arguing that until it is absolutely 100% certain, and the United States hasn't arrived at that decision yet, and the deployments still show that they're probably going to do it and they're preparing to do it, but we're not at that last moment when we know they're going to do it. The second thing is, and this is more operational, Israel has it's like martial arts, it's like all this stuff. The most vulnerable point for a military is as they're about to strike. All the missiles are out of protection, out of their bunkers, they're loading fuel, they're in vulnerable places that are out in the open, and so forth. So it makes sense for Israel to wait to the last moment to hit uh, the structures, both that have exposed themselves and only those that are preparing to fire on Israel. So they don't waste an effort on a site that was anyway going to stay quiet for the first wave. So I could see Israel wanting to wait until that last critical moment when they're most vulnerable and strike then. There's also potentially an operational problem, which is the Jordanians have made it very clear that they will not allow Israel to operate in their airspace. Again, they won't let America operate in their airspace against Iran. They've said that nobody is allowed to pass through Jordan. Now, that's one thing when missiles are flying through Jordan and America has to go up and shoot them down and Israel has to go up and shoot them down. But in terms of a preemption, the Jordanians would consider that to be a casus belli. They've said your airspace is. So if it's not in reaction to missiles, that's a big problem. So there might be an operational reason there. Again, I don't buy into it, but I could see Israeli planners worried about that.
What, if anything, did we learn that's revealing or useful knowledge, important to understand about Israel's capabilities to strike Iran from the Haniyeh assassination? What did we learn from that about Israel's capabilities?
I believe what that showed as well as Israel's extremely limited response to the missiles in April, is that Israel has excellent penetration capability at the most sensitive levels and sites in Iran. And as a result, if Israel made such a choice to begin to destabilize the regime in Iran, it is conceivable that it can do so.
So, okay. All right. Now let's just go for a second to the whole concept of deterrence. One of the things that drives me bananas about the military discourse in Israel, as reflected in the media, and I think that the media discourse is very reflective of the IDF's discourse because it's fueled by leaks from the military. At any rate, after every major attack, whether it's the assassination of Haniyeh or the assassination of Shukr or any major operation anywhere, the immediate response is this restores deterrence. Yeah, our deterrence is restored now. And I mean, first of all, I guess the first question would be, is there a direct correlation between killing a bunch of terrorists and restoring deterrence, or what would be a reasonable, is that even a reasonable, first of all, is that even a reasonable claim? Or is that as crazy as it always just sounds to me? You kill somebody, you don't have deterrence, you have people dead, which is oftentimes quite good if they're very important enemies and they should therefore be dead. I mean, how do you view this? First of all, this claim, any major successful attack, we've got deterrence again.
Well, first of all, there's a fundamental contradiction in the way deterrence has evolved in the West, and this includes Israel. The whole essence of deterrence is that you threaten your enemy to such an extent that he's terrified of you. But the way deterrence is employed by the West, it reflects fear of war. That it reflects a severe hesitation to escalate by the West, including Israel. So the very employment of deterrence proves exactly the sort of weakness to the enemy that they take comfort in, and undermines any deterrent effect you may have. So there's this irony. The West really has come to the point, and Israel in particular has come to the point, where you have to reestablish deterrence. And reestablishing it obviously is not by doing the same that you've been doing for 25 years and not succeeding. Obviously, something isn't working. And I've heard this going all the way back to 1996, Operation Grapes of Wrath. You constantly had the military from day one say, we showed them. They won't dare. Nireh lehem. Her'enu lehem in Hebrew. You had this chest-beating confidence that was utterly inappropriate and was proven wrong within months and weeks. In all cases, whether it's 1996, 2006, the various panoplies of wars that we've had with Hamas, after every single round, it was very clear that they felt they won. They were not deterred. They were just preparing for the next round. And that if there was a deterrence, it was Israel from doing decisive action to win. The second thing is that Israel discusses deterrence because it doesn't believe in victory. And again, this is a larger Western malady. And I think this is a very dangerous idea that has trickled into Western ideas, that victory is unattainable. You can't beat an idea. This is an ahistorical, I hate to say it, an ignorant point of view. Throughout history, ideas have been obliterated. Throughout history, victory has been the only way to obliterate ideas, to inflict the absolute certainty of disempowerment that victory entails is what discredits the ideas that motivated the other side in war. And that has been consistent throughout history. And yet, for some reason, the West has come to this idea that you can't win. And what it really reflects is a lack of will to win. And that is, again, undermines the deterrence. If you don't have the will to win, then the other side reads that, and then you can't deter them. So all these elements are, I believe, wrong. The third part of deterrence that I think is wrong is that it has to be attuned to the values of your enemy. After all, you have to hurt them where they feel there's value. Unfortunately, if somebody wants to be a martyr, obliging him doesn't have a deterrent effect. You can't deter a suicide bomber through the threat of shooting him. He's committed to dying, and I think you have to look at Hamas and Hezbollah essentially as a suicide bomber on an organizational level. You can't stop them. You may even there are, I would argue, a number of people with their hands on the control on the steering wheel in Iran who believe this. Whether it was the Mahdists under Ahmadinejad, or whether it's Saeed Jalili, who was the national security advisor and almost became president right now, or Raisi, etc., or even Khamenei himself. They really do believe in this apocalyptic view of the world. And we don't believe in belief to that level in the West anymore, but we have to understand they do. So Soleimani believed that too. So it's very difficult to deter somebody who is willing to die in terms of threatening them with death. So what does deter them? Humiliation and defeat. But what does bring humiliation and defeat? In the Middle East, I think the only way defeat is truly ingrained is the humiliation of losing territory, and losing territory permanently. If Israel made it clear that what happened in 67 and the loss of territory is followed up by a permanent loss of territory. And this is one of the reasons why it is so dangerous for anybody in Israel in the West to countenance Israel's returning to the 48 borders. Israel must emerge from any final settlement. I don't care if you're far to the left and you want to give the Palestinians 99% of the territory. They must understand that the 67 war resulted in a permanent loss of territory. Similarly, all subsequent.
It's not that I disagree with you. I totally agree with you. I mean, I think that we should be annexing South Lebanon up to the Litani River, just as Amiad Cohen said on a podcast of mine about a month and a half. I think that we should be settling and annexing at least northern Gaza and the Philadelphia corridor, and 3 kilometer wide strip as a buffer zone that becomes incorporated in Israeli territory. I see the strategic imperative of doing all of those things. But when you look at the international environment where Israel is being criminalized not only as a state, but as an idea, or people who
Yeah,
can't even, safely say that they support Israel's existence at Harvard anymore, or as the governor of the state of Pennsylvania. How can we, practically speaking, even talk about this? Meaning, is it possible that the international diplomatic atmosphere, environment that we exist in, where we are a small state and we're having political warfare waged against us by the most powerful international conglomerates, the UN, the EU, all of these NGO networks, everything. Is it even feasible to discuss it out loud? I mean, Smotrich, but Bezalel Smotrich said yesterday, the finance minister, the head of the Zionist nationalism or whatever party, he said, the international community won't allow it, but I think that it would have been fair for 2 million Gazans to have been expelled after October 7th, something along those lines. Now, under normal circumstances, if we were just a normal state, if we were Canada and we had a finance minister in the coalition saying that, it would be totally acceptable and nobody would find it to be a strange statement.
yeah.
But Bezalel Smotrich said it, and that automatically is going to be used by, assorted countries who are going to petition the ICJ and use it as proof that Israel is committing genocide. So I mean, I can see the
I
value. In fact, I can see the imperative in what you're saying. But I'm
no,
wondering, how are we
I
supposed
think,
to look at this international diplomatic climate?
but I think that at the end, that's as a fourth point. I don't think deterrence is a strategy. It is buying time, but buying time for what? It's stopping your enemy from attacking, but for what end? How do you eventually get over to the next phase? So I don't believe it's strategically important. The second thing is,
So
or
it's
the
not
next thing is that
strategically important because we can't actually achieve
you
the
can't actually
clear-cut
achieve it.
victory
And
that we need, or why?
I think that, but also the fourth point, which is that I believe that at the end of the day, even if you have if you imagine you have deterrence, nothing replaces defense and offense is part of defense. What I mean is the ability to fight and win in order to protect yourself has to remain the bottom line of Israel.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, we just sort of, you said something and it got swallowed up. And I want to make sure I understand what you said and make
Mhm.
it clear. Did you just say that given the international diplomatic climate and the unlikelihood that an Israeli move to annex territory, which would give us that clear-cut win that we could build a new deterrence model on it. Given that that's not viable at this moment, we should stop talking about deterrence altogether because it's irrelevant to our current strategic climate. Is that what you said?
I would almost go as far as saying that. Yes, I think at this point with the international climate, the vulnerability of Israel to the enemies around it, the determination, the failures of Israel's strategic imagination for the last 50 years, all combine to make deterrence very weak, if not practically non-existent. And there's also a question whether Israel has the character to do the sort of things to truly deter the enemy. I mean, for example, expelling 2 million Palestinians, taking half of Gaza and annexing it, or all of Gaza and annexing it. It's not clear that Israel has the will to do it. So, to me, what it says is that Israel has to return to the traditional policy of war fighting and war winning in order to protect itself. And that means a couple things. One is that the defense realm of Israel begins in the minimum at the mandatory borders. Israel must maintain positive control. That means presence, not some fancy censor. Presence, military presence of substance on its borders. And by borders, I mean Jordan River, all the border of Egypt from the sea to Eilat. And in the north, it's more murky because the mandatory border isn't really the natural border. So that's a big question, what happens up north. I think the Golan actually resolved that. It is a good border, potentially. I think there are elements of Jordan too, but you got to deal with diplomatic realities. But at the end of the day, Israel
What
needs
about in South Lebanon? What about restoring
well,
the security
the
zone in
real
South Lebanon that we idiotically left in 2000?
I think the security zone is an absolute, and Israel has to maintain positive control of everything that goes on below the Litani River at this point. It can do that in coordination with the South Lebanese army being resurrected, but that's going to take some work because the Lebanese don't trust Israel. They've been
No.
betrayed once before. So Israel really needs to also think about the character of Lebanon and what emerges in Lebanon after such a war. It can't have Hezbollah sitting there at the Litani River, even in my view. I think they have to be pushed beyond the Awali River, but that pushes them into Druze and Christian territory, and hopefully the Druze and Christians won't like that either. So at the end of the day, you really do have to get rid of Hezbollah. And then you could work it out with the Druze and Christians to have a buffer zone that has an active Israeli presence on the Litani River to actually monitor what goes in and comes out. And it may be sovereign part of Lebanon, but Israeli troops have to be there as part of the force. Whatever, I don't want to get too far into that. The bottom line, though, is that Gaza has to be behind an Israeli defense line. Judea and Samaria have to be behind an Israeli defense line. And that Israel must maintain full security control over that area. And that means no army, not even a small little militia type army, if can exist beyond that border. And Israel has to return to a policy of preemption and prevention. Any threat emerging, Britain had this policy for 100 years. It had, or 200 years, it had a policy that any navy, any combination of two top navies in Europe must remain weaker than the British Armada. And that therefore Britain will preempt to destroy any European navy that added to another navy threatens Britain. That's what Israel sort of needs to do now with its neighbors. It basically has to take the position that capability, not intent anymore, is what it is after, and it has to demand of whatever emerges in Syria and in Jordan and in Lebanon and in Egypt a severe limitation. In Egypt, maybe geographically, it already is in the peace treaty with the Sinai. Israel has to maintain that aggressively,
Well, it's not.
but
I
maybe
mean,
even
the Sinai
more.
is remilitarized. And that is a
Not. I mean,
fact.
it's part of the collapse of Israeli defense imagery. They've allowed so much to deteriorate because they thought, okay, it's a violation. It's not a big deal. Everything is a big deal now. And October 6th told us you can't assume away a threat. What happened on October 6th into October 7th is taught us that. So I think you need to have a preemptive strategy. And essentially, Israel's back in the 50s and 60s. It doesn't have the latitude anymore and the luxury to assume deterrence does the trick, to assume the world will defend it, to assume that it can predict the war effectively, and absorb and assume that it has the power to absorb a first strike. So if you take away all those assumptions, Israel has to return to a preemptive strategy that is based on judging enemy capability and not enemy intention.
I think you're absolutely right. And I actually think that this may be the key takeaway from everything that we've been seeing, both diplomatically and militarily I mean, obviously since October 7th, but and it hasn't been discussed. We keep using a discourse that was bad and damaging, since we started using it, which is this deterrence model, without understanding deterrence, without understanding the enemy, without understanding what victory means, without understanding the relationship between victory or fighting to stalemate and deterrence. So I mean, that if people just take away, this point that we can't have, that none of our strategic thinking should be based on anything having to do with deterrence, because the thing that you need in order to build deterrence is unavailable to us due to diplomatic constraints, among other things today. I think that will make this an incredibly important show. And now I just want to tap onto two other things, and one is Egypt, and I think we'd be remiss if we're doing a strategic discourse on what's happening now without discussing Egypt. And then the other thing is, okay, well, now that we're beginning to understand things and we're sort of beginning to, shake ourselves free from the delusions that have been, the basis of our discussion about Israel's strategic options. How are we're looking at this situation. What are we supposed to make of it? I mean, Iran is on the precipice, if it doesn't already have a nuclear arsenal. Hezbollah may have electromagnetic pulse bombs because that's what they claim. And I don't even, I mean, like, how are we even supposed to look at it? But first, let's look at Egypt, because you said we have to assert 100%, control over Judea and Samaria. That means we have to get rid of the Palestinian Authority army, which is an American equity, and we have to get rid of it. I mean, they so
Yeah.
much.
By the way, I mean, we can come back to it later. I think there's an ideological or a ideational reason for getting rid of it too.
Yeah,
I do
I
not
couldn't. I
believe you
wrote a
could
book about it, but I mean, I couldn't
yeah.
agree more. But I'm just saying that that the problem, we do. But what do we do with Egypt? I mean, Egypt, by all accounts, has remilitarized the Sinai because we let them, because because they were fighting ISIS and we were helping them and we were all excited because we were on this honeymoon with Sisi after he overthrew the Muslim Brotherhood. And now we see that under Sisi, literally under him, they opened up a highway not only across the Suez Canal, under the canal, where you have tanks can go under the canal to get into the Sinai now, but you also have the same thing going into Gaza from Sinai.
Yeah,
So
think
I mean,
I think
what do we do? This is quite a
I
pickle.
think one has to come to terms. I think one has to come to terms with the fact that the defense establishment's failure on October 7th with Hamas may turn out to be the smaller failure. The bigger failure is the inability to understand what was going on with Egypt. And that is something that can haunt Israel greatly going forward. What do I mean by that? First of all, yes, in 2014, because of the fight with Erdogan, Sisi overthrew Morsi. Morsi was the close ally of Erdogan in Turkey. Turkey and Egypt were mortal enemies at that point. Hamas was greatly aligned with Turkey. So Sisi saw Hamas as a mortal threat. And actually, in 2014, wanted Israel to be much more aggressive and go further. But that's the point at which the Israeli intelligence and general staff and defense establishment in Israel froze in time. And they didn't watch anything that was happening after that. First of all, before that, I don't think they took seriously the corruption, the bakshish, the payments, the bribes to get weaponry into Gaza. The fact that Gaza had so much weaponry told you that border was already porous. But I think since 2014, there's been a fundamental shift in Egypt, where Egypt's view of the Muslim Brotherhood is fundamentally different than what it was in 2014. And there's a number of reasons for it. One, I believe, is that Egypt, if UAE or Saudi Arabia make peace with Israel, it's because of the strong horse argument. They have enemies in the region. They don't particularly see Israel as threatening them. Israel being a strong horse around which you can defend yourself, latch your cart to, and have defense, is why they would make peace. That's not why Egypt made peace. Egypt made peace because they read the geopolitical circumstances of the Cold War, and Sadat made a judgment that America actually, in the end, despite Vietnam at the time, and despite as bad as it looked, Egypt understood that their long-term interests lay with the West Bloc, which would eventually prevail over the Soviet Union. And Sadat understood that to make himself part of the West Bloc in the Cold War, he had to pay a price. So peace with Israel was ultimately for Egypt a function of geopolitical interest that was global, not the immediate regional stronghorse argument that it is for Saudi Arabia or the UAE. Well, what's happening now? Ever since President Obama is toying with the Muslim Brotherhood in the mid-2010s, ever since the United States seems to have lost its way with Saudi Arabia. And remember, in 2014, Egypt and Saudi Arabia were lockstep. You had an intelligence minister in Saudi Arabia who was extremely close to Assisi, and the UAE as well. It was a triangular relationship that dealt with Libya, that dealt with the Muslim Brotherhood, dealt with Turkey, dealt with all ISIS, the whole panoply of things. Well, Obama started turning against Saudi Arabia. Obama tried to appease the Muslim Brotherhood and tried to appease Erdogan in Turkey. Obama tried to help the coalitional government in Tripoli and Libya, which included Erdogan's people and the Muslim Brotherhood, which would have put Erdogan on the border of Egypt. So the United States essentially went against Haftar, which was Egypt's security buffer, against Erdogan's forces in Libya. Essentially, Egypt began to feel that they and Saudi Arabia and UAE were under siege from the United States. And the UAE and Egypt thought that the UAE and Saudi Arabia thought maybe by bringing Israel in, they can weather that. But Egypt began to toy with Russia, and they began to hedge. And I think the Trump administration halted that drift, but the Biden administration has so obliterated America's position in the region that I think Egypt has made the conclusion that there's no point paying the piper on the Western alliance, and instead is shifting allegiance to the other bloc. And with that, the peace treaty goes away. So I think if you look at the tectonic movements of geopolitics, Egypt is headed in a very dangerous direction, and Israel needs to pay attention to that. Peace is right now existing on inertia, but it's not existing because tectonically it is the trend.
Well, we have to have a whole conversation about this. I mean, I think, because then the question becomes, the heck are we supposed to do? Because our options are limited. I mean, Egypt is armed to the teeth, not only with American platforms, but as you said, now with Russian platforms as well, and with Chinese platforms. And these are things that Israel can't duplicate because we don't have that kind of relationship either with the Chinese or with the Russians. So, they have a diversified military. They have I think they have an Abrams tank factory in Aswan. So, I mean, you're looking at.
Israel has some ability to influence America's. Unfortunately, it will probably accelerate the move of Egypt away from peace, but it will shore up Israel's defense capability. And again, I believe Israel must think now very purely and narrowly in terms of its ability to fight, and rather than try to be too clever and manipulate too much. Egypt is now openly expressing hostility to Israel. By the way, it's not. If you listen to what Assisi said to his military units 2 weeks ago, this was a rather hostile thing toward Israel. The rhetoric is there already. I believe Israel can work with its friends in the United States to begin to restrict the sorts of weapons that Egypt can get. I mean, if Egypt gets guns, that's one thing. But if Egypt gets these advanced pieces of equipment, there's no reason why Egypt needs them. I mean, Libya doesn't really threaten Egypt. Sudan doesn't really threaten Egypt in terms of sophisticated armies. Egypt doesn't need the most advanced fighters and the most advanced artillery and all this stuff. It's designed to go after Israel. So I think Israel needs to work with its friends in the United States to essentially begin to constrict the flow of more advanced weaponry to Egypt. And I think Israel has that influence still. And I think a lot of Americans are very nervous
Not
about
sure a lot
Egypt
of
as
Americans
well
are thinking about the threat
because
that
of that.
Egypt poses. I think they have to start thinking about it.
They also are nervous about giving Egypt a lot of weapons. So I think you don't need to see Egypt as an enemy, but they need to start seeing Egypt as a country in which you don't want advanced American weapons to go to. Sort of the way the United States, many in America now look at Erdogan. They don't want him to get the F-22s or F-35s. They don't want them to get the most advanced air defense systems because they don't trust them. So I think you could work with people in America to do that. But the second thing is I think Israel has to start thinking seriously about shoring up its southern border. It needs to start really drawing the line with Egypt that it has to come into compliance with the Camp David peace agreements, and that whatever tanks are there should be thinned out, or in the very least, nothing more, and that Israel would react to it, and by violating its side. I mean, if Egypt is violating its restrictions, Israel could start exacting penalties on Egypt by moving forces up to the border, by restricting certain things with Egypt, and so on and so forth. Then finally, I would be. I mean, at the end of the day, I think Israel's entering this period where it must think like Sparta. It has to assume that all its borders are dangerous. I would add, Jordan, you may love King Abdullah of Jordan. I think he's a fine guy. I don't think he's quite up to the job. But Jordan is not a stable country. It may not survive. And Israel doesn't want to have to begin to prepare for that after it happens. So, frankly, I think Israel needs to think of its borders as something it has to defend actively. and it needs to start building the military and the deployments and the force structures and the presence along the border that it needs to have in order to ensure that it has the power to deal with that. And if there's this deterioration in Syria with violations of the buffer zones there, if there's a movement of forces south, in my view, of the Awali River in Lebanon, not the Litani River, if there's any further remilitarization of the Sinai, Israel has to draw a very hard red line,
Right.
and it has to say so now. It has to say that Israel's position is dangerous enough that it can tolerate no more deterioration that violates any of these understandings or agreements, whether it's 1701, UN 1701 in Lebanon, the disengagement 1974 disengagement agreements on the Golan, or the Camp David peace agreements, that it cannot tolerate any further deterioration in it, and it would be considered a
What
casus
about
belli.
now? What about August 7th? I mean, what August 8th? I guess this is going to go up. How are we supposed to look at Iran's threat? I mean, obviously we take them seriously, but I mean, like, where do they plant Israel right now? How do you assess our strategic environment today?
I think Iran, its entire strategic environment depends on manipulating the United States to tie Israel's hands. That is right now Iran's strategy and its power. It threatens Israel through Hezbollah. It threatens Israel through direct attack. It knows that it is highly vulnerable to Israeli preemption and Israeli attack on Hezbollah. It counts on the fact that the United States restrains Israel from doing that. So the entirety of Iranian policy boils down to manipulating America currently to tie Israel up. At the end of the day, Israel has far more power than it is willing to admit to itself, and it has sufficient power that would rattle the regime in Tehran enough that it would, in very least, put it on the strategic defensive, and that could have consequences itself. I won't go as far as to say that it could bring down the regime, but certainly regimes like that do not fare well when they're defensive and when they're on their hind leg, on
All
their
right,
on
well,
their heels.
I'm gonna leave it at that. I think I wanted to do the 360-degree analysis, and I think we did it. I'm pretty sure we did it. We're gonna have to revisit the Egypt question maybe after we get the all clear signal, God willing, from Iran and Lebanon. But I think I think that the key insight that we had here about deterrence not being a model that it is particularly useful to Israel, I think is the key insight to take away from this show, guys. And we use a lot of terms. We use a lot of terms that are just not relevant to our reality. It's in domestic policy, it's in foreign policy, it's in strategic discussions, and we have to stop. We are in crunch time on a lot of different levels today, in the West, obviously in Israel. And we do ourselves a disservice by using terms and using concepts that are totally irrelevant to our strategic environment. And we have to stop it. We have to stop it already. And so I think this was a good start. And we'll continue on forward marching into the future. All right, well, guys, we'll see you again later. Hopefully, when I'm back home, because if I'm doing another one from Chicago, it means something big happened that I have to discuss with you. So if we get the all clear, I'll see you again next week from Israel. And Dave, thank you so much for joining me. And I'm going to have you back sooner rather than later to continue this very important discussion.